Now, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was felt by businesses around the world. Businesses had to deal with many issues ranging from employee and customer safety to business continuity. Many were first forced to shut their doors. But how have companies in Africa responded to the outbreak? To discuss this further, I'm joined by Professor Ralph Hamann from the University of Cape Town. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you very much for joining us. Now, the jury is still out on whether the crisis lead to innovation or to the opposite. What are some of the varied responses to the COVID-19 pandemic have you witnessed over the last couple of years, and the way that companies on the continent have been able to navigate?
Yes, well, we studied something like 25 companies in 4 African countries, Mauritius, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, with colleagues from those countries. And we found that, in fact, there are some companies that restrict themselves and their strategies and their efforts in trying to address social and environmental issues. And other companies actually used the crisis, or they were inspired by the crisis, to expand their efforts in contributing to sustainability. So we think that's quite an important finding to really demonstrate that there is not a single response to a crisis, but that for some companies it is a restricting response, and other companies can in fact innovate and become more expansive in their efforts.
In the study, what factors did you identify that perhaps influence these companies to remain sustainable in the current times?
Well, I think, as you may expect, some companies were more severely affected financially than other companies. So if you are a hotel business or an airline or something like that, where COVID-19 led to a very radical restriction to your business, those companies clearly were struggling to just stay alive, so to speak. And we did look at the effect, or the severity of the effect, of the crisis on a company. But we also looked at other things. We looked at the degree to which a company before the crisis had invested in sustainability efforts, in their taking care of their employees and being responsive to community interests around their operations and things like that. So in other words, did they invest in sustainability before the crisis, and did that have an effect, right? So if you just take those 2 factors for a moment, then we did find that companies that did have investments in sustainability before the crisis, they actually had very important resources and abilities that they could make use of in the crisis to expand their efforts. And it was particularly important in that time, right? Because so many people were struggling, also a lot of employees were struggling, and companies that had some of those resources in place were able to respond to the epidemic or the pandemic, and really support the employees, support communities around their operations. So those are just 2 of the factors that we looked at. We did look at some others as well.
Yeah, those are very critical factors because they are positive factors in responding to the pandemic, but there were also factors which you found in the research where companies responded in a way that didn't really react to responding to sustainability or the goals thereof. You did mention the upliftment of communities and so, but in this regard, what were some of those factors that you identified?
Well, again, if a company had invested in those kinds of things before the crisis, they would have kind of an attitude and also an ability to respond to community concerns during a crisis. The other factor, though, that we also looked at is, the quality of government and the degree to which government was able to provide public goods and services. And so in those contexts where government was really struggling to respond to the pandemic, some companies, in fact, saw that as a need or a motivation to, in a sense, fill the gaps left by weak government capacity. So that was also one reason that we identified, where some companies used the crisis to, in fact, expand their sustainability efforts. On the flip side, in those contexts where companies considered their governance context or the quality of government to be diminishing, then those companies were more likely to restrict during the crisis, because they realized, they saw the crisis as yet another factor that was enhancing the risks that they were facing as a business. So they would basically kind of, we call it bunker down. They would, try to do as little as possible that is new or in some ways risky, right? So the quality of government was another factor that we considered in our research.
Tell us about the cost-cutting strategies that were implemented by these companies and the implications that they had.
Well, I mean, I think that there were very diverse strategies, and of course it depends on the kind of company in the sector. We did look at companies in very diverse sectors, ranging from hospitality to logistics to mining and banking. One of the concerns that we had in some companies was that if companies were restricting their sustainability efforts, one of those were, for example, contributions to communities, right? So corporate social investment, as we call it here in South Africa, we did see some budgets shrink for that kind of thing in some companies, but also on environmental aspects. I think quite a few companies, they shrunk some of their budgets for environmental maintenance or management issues. So those are some of the concerns that we had. And of course, particularly badly hit companies, they also had to reduce their employee numbers and so on, which is, of course, also a very significant impact, especially for those workers and their families.
I want to go back to the notion that I presented in my intro, Prof, this notion of innovation and really just companies embracing this as they were hit with the pandemic. Did you find that there was a general openness to innovation and adapting with the times, or did you find that companies remained almost rigid or protectionist in the way that they were running things?
Well, precisely, as I mentioned, it was both of those responses. Different companies emphasized one or the other of those responses. And, perhaps you can almost imagine this as a kind of a corollary or kind of a, metaphorically, as individuals. We also have different responses to tough times. Some people thrive under pressure. Other people will be a little bit more inward focused and will, be a little bit more constricted. And I think companies, to some extent, display similar kind of characteristics. And I think one of the lessons from this research is that if you can invest in strategies and capabilities to, look after your workers, look after the communities around your operations and so on, if you do that when times are good, those are very important investments when times turn difficult, because those investments will give you precisely the abilities that you point to innovate and to do new things, to respond in a very creative and committed way in a crisis situation.
And then, of course, this brings in the issue around public-private partnerships, something that's gotten a lot of traction over the last 2 years. Government alone does not have the resources to deal with what we saw as the pandemic, and so private sector doesn't have the resources to deal with it on its own. Tell us a little bit about the importance of the role of public-private partnerships and its growth potentially in the years to come.
Well, I think, during COVID-19, if we just consider South Africa, for example, for a moment, both at the local level, where some companies were partnering with municipalities or, in other words, local government, but also at the national level where we had the Solidarity Fund, which I think most people really think did a very, very important job in South Africa to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, but also on households, vulnerable households. So that was, I think, a very good example of a public-private partnership where companies came together, worked with the government in all kinds of ways, to make available some of the equipment, the protective gear, also the medical response to support that. Many people saw this as a kind of inspiration because they thought, and we discovered this also in our research, people saw this as a kind of a demonstration of just how much can be achieved if business and government come together, have a common agenda, and pull, kind of on the same kind of strings in that kind of way. Now, of course, one of the other things that we do find in crisis situations is a crisis really catalyzes collaboration because everyone is, so to speak, in the same boat. And as the crisis diminishes, one of our interviewees in this kind of research calls it the emergency feeling. When that emergency feeling subsides, then that common agenda often dissipates a little bit. Then people's diverse interests and perspectives on situations, they then basically become more prominent again. So it's actually very difficult to maintain that common sense of purpose that often characterizes crisis responses.